Thank you, Don. It's great to be here today. In fact, it's just been a great week overall. Hasn't it been, you guys? It really has. In fact, I've got absolutely nothing to complain about, Don, except for the fact that you put me on after a Baptist preacher. You see, that's the only thing I can complain about because that was really, you really brought it, Pastor. Thank you so much for that. Very powerful. Grateful. And also thanks to Janice Shaw-Krause and everybody behind the scenes making this program work, the camera people that allow you to see what happens here on your screens. I can't tell you how much is going on off stage to make what we do here on stage and what you experience in the audience work as well as it does. It's really been a remarkable and amazing week, and I'm so grateful for the chance to be here today. You know, when I was first presented with the title of this panel, Problems Facing Families Around the World, I was a bit overwhelmed. I've been a journalist and have traveled the world in pursuit of stories off and on for the past 25 years, and I've seen plenty of problems. In fact, that's what magazines and newspapers that I've been a part of are full of, problems. After all, you don't sell a lot of newspapers if you put out a headline that says, well, nothing much happened today, just go about your business. So I should ask the question, where would we begin talking about problems? What are the biggest problems facing families around the world? They might be economic issues, maybe same-sex marriage. Of course, there's abortion, which we've talked about this week, and the demographic, emotional, and spiritual costs to us all that abortion has brought, including, of course, families. And I'm well aware that many of you are not from the United States. In fact, Janice told me backstage just before I came out that about 65 countries are represented at this conference this week. So maybe we should talk about China's one-child or now perhaps two-child policy because of that policy change this week. Maybe the demographic collapse that many countries in Europe are facing. And of course, there's ISIS and other forms of radical Islam. Now, back here in the United States, we have $18 trillion of federal government debt. That translates to about $150,000 in debt for every family in America. So if you look at this litany of problems, it is pretty easy to get discouraged. In fact, when the Obergefell decision legalizing so-called same-sex marriage came down, the decision that you referenced just a few moments ago, when it was announced, my friend and co-author of our book, Restoring All Things, John Stonestreet, got a call from a mutual friend of ours, and that friend was very nearly in despair. He said, "John, it's over." Now, John challenged our friend, and it's what I would challenge us with today by asking this question: what is over? What exactly is over? Has God left his throne? He has not. Is he not still sovereign? He is. When the Obergefell decision came down from the Supreme Court, did God say, "Wow, I sure didn't see that coming"? Friends, he did not say that. So while I'm going to talk to you about some of the problems we're facing today, I want to make sure that you hear this. The story of the universe, God is still writing. The arc of history is still unfolding. Unlike what our friend said, it is not over. And I've read the last chapter of the book, and guess what? God wins. Can I get an amen to that? Now, that's not to say that between now and then we won't have lots of battles to fight and lots of problems to solve. But I want to be clear, I think we should be happy warriors in this process, knowing that God is indeed building the house. God is indeed on our side, and we have the great joy of participating in what God is doing in the world, if only we will. So I'd like to take a few minutes, the few minutes I have today, to make a few points and tell a few stories about how we got into this mess and maybe how we can get out of it. Now, in the first chapter of our book, Restoring All Things, John Stonestreet and I observed that the Bible is full of what we call re-words, words that begin with R-E, words like reconcile and redeem and restore. I should say, though, that too often many people of faith, Christians in particular, have focused on other re-words, words like resist and rebuke and restrain and reject. Now, I want to be clear, there's no doubt that in a world that's moving in the wrong direction, resisting and restraining and rejecting is often the proper posture, especially for those of us who want to promote the good, the true, and the beautiful. But while we hold up one hand of restraint, I'd like to say to us today that we should also be offering a hand of restoration and reconciliation. And the reason for that is because in the world of ideas, you can't fight bad ideas with no ideas. You can't fight something with nothing. So I would say that if my task with you here today is to identify the biggest problems we face, I would leap past the litany of horribles that I mentioned at the top of my speech and offer this as my first piece of advice to the pro-family movement. We must become known more for what we stand with and for, and less by what we stand against. Now, the second piece of advice that I would offer to the pro-family movement, to you and me, my brothers and sisters in this movement, is that we need to recover the art of storytelling. Now, that piece of advice may not seem obvious to you, but let me back up just a little bit and tell you about a friend of mine named Andrew Peterson. Andrew Peterson is a musician and a novelist that many of you in this room may know about. He also happens to be a friend, so when John and I were rolling out our book, Restoring All Things, with a series of events around the country, we asked Andrew to be our musical guest, and he graciously said yes. Andrew would always start his part of the presentation with this. He would say, if you want someone to hear the truth, you should tell them the truth. But if you want someone to love the truth, you should tell them a story. I think that's why the great philosopher and musicologist Damon of Athens said this more than 2,000 years ago. Give me the songs of a people, and I care not who writes its laws. The power and importance of storytelling should, of course, come as no surprise to those of us who are Christians, because Jesus himself was a storyteller. Mark 4:34 says that Jesus did not speak to them except in parables. In other words, except in stories. I should say that those on the other side of the cultural divide, liberals and progressives, seem to understand this reality better than we conservatives. As just one example, let me mention the television program Will and Grace. Consider this timeline. In 1996, the U.S. Congress passed the Defense of Marriage Act, or DOMA, and it was a law that many in this room were probably in favor of. A Democratic president, Bill Clinton, signed that bill into law. But then in 1998, 2 years later, Will and Grace premiered. It aired for 8 seasons, and for 4 of those seasons, it was the #1 situation comedy on television. The rest, as they say, is history. By the time Will and Grace went off the air, significant portions of DOMA had already been overturned. By 2014, same-sex marriage was legal in more than 30 states, despite the fact that in virtually every state where the voters had a chance to decide, same-sex marriage had been rejected. And then, of course, came the Obergefell decision, and it became legal in the other states. That's one of the reasons why Joe Biden, the Vice President of the United States, said this, and I'm quoting here, that Will and Grace did more to educate the American public on LGBT issues than almost anything else has ever done so far. Of course, I got to say that reminds me of Reagan's famous saying that it's not that liberals are ignorant, it's just that most of what they know is wrong. So the education that Will and Grace offered to the American public was not the kind of education that, of course, we think is true, but it was an education that stuck in the cultural imagination. In fact, the Smithsonian Institution has added items from the television program Will and Grace to its LGBT history collection. Chuck Colson, who was one of my mentors and the namesake of the Colson Center for Christian Worldview, where I now serve as vice president, was fond of saying this, and I think it's very relevant to this part of our conversation. Politics is downstream from culture. We as Christians, as people of faith, we have to be culture shapers if we want to win the political, the economic, and other conversations that are taking place in the world around us. And storytelling is one of the key ways that we can make and shape culture. So friends, if facts, data, history, logic, and reason would win the cultural argument, we would have already won that conversation. Now, I do thank God that all of those are on our side. In fact, I've been encouraged and equipped by all the studies and the surveys that we've heard this week from people like Brad Wilcox and Mark Rignaris and other researchers. I've been very nourished by that, by their research. And I could, if I would, maybe could be allowed an aside here, I would add that we owe these men a special debt. They operate in an environment, the liberal secular academy, in which any deviation from prevailing progressive dogma is often not tolerated. So the research that Brad and Mark and others have done requires moral courage and requires them to take pretty significant professional risk, and we should thank and support them when and how we can. But it does not diminish their great work to observe that what they do, while necessary, even vital, is not sufficient to win the cultural arguments. So those of us in the pro-family movement must recover the art of storytelling if we're going to move the cultural needle on significant cultural arguments of our day. So remember what we stand for and not just what we stand against. Secondly, let's recover the lost art of storytelling. Third, and finally, we must remember and serve the victims of the sexual revolution and the anti-family ideologies that have been dominant in our world for the 19th and 20th century, some of the ideologies that you talked about. A book that impacted me greatly, and many others, was a book called Ideas Have Consequences by Richard Weaver. Many of you in this room probably know that book. Even many who have not read that book would understand a key idea just from the title. Ideas do indeed have consequences. Ideas matter. But friends, I would also share with you today that ideas have more than just consequences, they have victims. Marxism was an idea cooked up in the academy in the 19th century. It became an ideology that cost 20 million lives in the 20th century. So let me say that while I've been encouraged by what I've seen here this week, and I do believe that God is doing something really marvelous, and we have a historic opportunity to participate in it. And I also would add that I think Alan Carlson was right when he spoke a couple of days ago, and we're on possibly the upswing of a new renaissance of the family in America. And I'm honored to stand with you to be a part of that. But I would also add, friends, that this downswing that we've experienced for the last 20 or 30 years has produced real victims. More than 50 million dead from abortion. And the terrible but true saying goes like this: every abortion produces one dead, but also one and possibly more than one wounded. The rise of homosexuality and other forms of sexual promiscuity over the past 30 years have been a contributing factor to the deaths of more than 25 million people because of AIDS. And again, every death leaves behind wounded and grieving loved ones, also victims of the sexual revolution. And if we're going to survive and triumph, we are going to have to learn once again to do what people of faith have always done, and that is to serve the victims of such plagues. So I'd like to close with a few brief stories that perhaps will help you see what I mean. Throughout history, Christians have faced dark times, times as dark as these before, persecution, even death. And they've triumphed not by running away from the darkness, but often by running towards it, running toward the misery of others, even sometimes if it created misery for themselves. The sociologist and historian Rodney Stark recounts many such stories in his book, The Rise of Christianity. For example, between 250 and 270 AD, a terrible plague that's sometimes called the Plague of Cyprian, after the man who wrote about it, devastated the Roman Empire. As many as 5,000 people succumbed in Rome alone. That plague coincided with an empire-wide persecution of Christians. In fact, many Christians were blamed for that plague. The claim, however, was undermined by two inconvenient truths. First, Christians were also dying from the plague, just like everyone else. And secondly, sometimes they were dying in even greater numbers because while the pagans were fleeing to the countryside, Christians were staying and caring for the sick. So Christians did not flee the plague, they cared for their pagan neighbors, unlike everyone else. And Rodney Stark said that because of the sacrificial care that Christians gave to their pagan neighbors, a remarkable thing happened. Within a generation of the plague of Cyprian, Christianity, which up until then had been a fringe and marginalized religion, had become the dominant religion of the Roman world. But we don't have to go back 18 centuries to see a similar example. As John and I were writing Restoring All Things, the Ebola Crisis broke out in Africa. Stephen Rowden was one of the many Christian doctors who volunteered to serve in Africa at great personal risk. In fact, Rowden was interviewed on National Public Radio, and the host, Robert Siegel, asked him about his faith and whether the Ebola plague had challenged his faith. Rowden said, "No, I get great strength from my faith and the support of my family." Friends, nearly 18 centuries after the plague of Cyprian, Christianity still prompts people to run toward the plague while virtually everyone else is running away. If we, as people of faith, want to participate fully in what God has in store for us, we must learn to serve in new ways the victims of anti-family and anti-Christian ideologies. We must volunteer in the pregnancy care centers represented here at the World Congress of Families by Heartbeat International and CareNet and other great groups. We must raise our own children in the nurture and admonition of the Lord, of course, but we must also adopt or become foster parents or support in meaningful ways those who do. In short, we must move into an era in which the gospel of Jesus Christ is not something we merely declare, but something we also demonstrate by the way we love the least and the lost, the victims who are among us. Now, I'd like to close with just one more story, again, a story that was in our book, Restoring All Things. It's the story of the city of Ephesus, a city that in the first century was dominated by the Temple of Artemis, one of the Greek gods. The priests of that temple maintained a perpetual fire there in worship of Artemis and the other deities. Fire was, of course, a basic necessity of life in that culture. It allowed for cooking, for cleaning, and for warmth. If the fire went out in the home, the residents, the inhabitants of that home were in big trouble. The only solution was to go to the temple with a ceramic bowl in order to get hot coals from the temple priest. The priest, of course, required a payment for tribute to appease the pagan gods and to maintain the temple itself. To get that fire from another source, the priest taught, was an affront to the gods and risked their wrath. However, the Christians, the small number of Christians in Ephesus, lived differently. When they noticed a home without fire, they would bring hot coals to that family from their own fires in their own fire bowls. This simple act of love of neighbor made a powerful statement. First, it provided life-saving fire to a person who had been too poor to pay a tribute to the temple. Secondly, it deprived the pagan temple of an important means of financial support. And thirdly, it proclaimed to the world that the Christians in Ephesus were not afraid of the pagan gods. Now, we have no record of those first century Christians picketing outside the Temple of Artemis or successfully having laws passed in their favor. But to close and to go back to the rewords I started with, these Christians did not merely resist, they restored. They undertook acts of kindness toward their neighbor at great personal risk because they were acting against the prevailing power structure. But in the end, their relentless kindness carried the day and sped the demise of the temple system and led to the rise of Christianity. Friends, families face many problems today, but I believe that if we can be clear about what we stand for and not merely what we stand against, if we can relearn the art of storytelling, telling the story of the good, the true, and the beautiful to a culture that has grown deaf and blind to such stories, and if we can relearn what was once a hallmark of the church, a life of radical, sacrificial service, of running towards the plague and not away from the plague, of being a fire bearer for those whose spiritual fire has been extinguished. If we can relearn these things, I believe that a golden age of the family, the golden age that Alan Carlson referred to a couple of days ago, and for which we all so profoundly long, will not be merely a part of our past, but a part of our future as well. Thank you very much.